Okay, so let's move on with our step. We talked a little bit how we might generate some of the decking based on the room sizes, the actual building room sizes, but then modifying them from there, aligning them perhaps with regulating lines. Let's move on to how you might also block views and use raised planting areas versus in-ground planting areas. Um, uh, these colors in the green right here we made so that they they communicate as raised planters. A raised planter may be something that, um, let's bring in an image to remind you. For example, this is a raised planter, right? And if I put a tree in the ground right here where the gravel is, that may be considered an in-ground plant versus a raised planter and a planted container planting as such. So, so for example, why did I decide to place a planter right there? Well, there's a library right here, and maybe the library needs to be screened from the more social, more louder space. Now, even though a plant may not screen sound, it may at least it will screen a little bit visually between that social space and the library. It may have tall plants in it. And it also, there's another planter right here that screens the view from the living room deck um, and the little more private deck by the bedrooms. So again, planters for screening views, strategically placed, and then they're actually biting into the deck itself, just the way our buildings bite into each other and they collide, and they subtract from each other. Same scenario there. The library has its own zone at the end of a hallway, and then maybe it's appropriate to make an exterior zone for it right there, right on the back side, with a planter that screens the view from a bad view on this end. So you may have a bad view on this side, and then so I'll decide to place a planter that's got tall trees in it. Your planters could be large like so, or they could be small like so. They could actually also be not planted all the way, right? This zone right here might have plants in it, and this part of the planter could become a bench that you can sit on. So let's move on to the next step right here. We are looking at something we previewed a little bit earlier. The landscape itself, and what type of landscape do I begin to plug into my zones that are generated from regulating lines that are born from the building itself. We have our softscape from tall to short. We have our hardscape, different materials expressed with different patterns. So we also have gravel. Sometimes gravel could be considered softscape or hardscape. People argue about that. You can make your own decision. Here's a first attempt at generating the softscape versus the hardscape. Now, this may be a little bit confusing to look at, but it could, as you move forward and you might look at it, it could look, if you do a print preview, you clean up a few things as your steps move along, it could look a little bit cleaner. This is it, for example, right here, and I think it looks fairly clean. You have your actual 3 bedrooms, your living dining, your other hallway, setting the library and study farther away from everything else. You can begin to see how the geometry of the exterior zones relate kind of the same way as the buildings themselves. Okay. There again, a decking for the living room immediately outside of it, tall landscape and a planter that separates the zone of the library decking. Again, same thing, planter separating the zone from the exterior zone of the living room further north of it. And then another zone, perhaps not immediately next to the building itself, but you may want to wander away from the building and come to a little more silent zone in your on your site. Slightly larger landscape, area, decking, and circulation zone that takes you back into your hallways. So when we look at it as such, it's a little bit clearer versus the entire AutoCAD that might look confusing. Let's move on a little bit further in terms of the process. As we're making the landscape and the hardscape here, you may actually make your own patterns if you like, if you enjoy doing line work in AutoCAD and identify them in a legend versus, say, hey, these are trees, these are short landscapes, so on and so forth. Having made these zones and placed my patterns inside of them, disciplined them based on the regulating lines born from the building. Again, regulating lines born of the building, and I decided to make a geometry out of that. Becomes the circulation, gets you to another exterior deck right on that end. From there, we'll move right along, and we'll talk about these next steps in the next video.